Hello guys, and welcome back to another week of me building a self-tracking app in Svelte 5. And this week I wanted to tackle the issue of ordering and dragging around different objects in our application. We have things like trackables, we have things like goals, we have a form editor, for example. I wanted to have a way for the user to drag these things around and move them and place them wherever they like. Maybe they want their sleep trackable to be the first thing that they see on the page. Well, we should not restrict them. We should let them move around their items freely. So we need a way to drag and drop items. So what did I do? Well, I scoured the internet trying to find a library of someone who has already done this before. I would rather not spend a couple of weeks implementing my own drag and drop solution if someone else already has a functioning library out there that handles all the weird edge cases that can occur. So I found this neat library called svelte-dnd, which is a fairly new library. It's actually written for Svelte 5, which is one of the main reasons I went to try it, because I want to use as many Svelte 5 libraries as possible. And this svelte-dnd actually leverages the browser's built-in drag and drop functionality. So there's actually a built-in HTML5 drag and drop functionality API that we can use. So the way the drag and drop API works is that we add this draggable property to the element that we want to be draggable, and then we implement some event handlers for the other stuff. So we actually need to have a way to communicate what element it is that we are dragging. So whenever we start dragging this button here, we set an actual attribute on the data transfer. We say that this is the element that we are dragging. We're getting the ID of the element that we are dragging. And then we have another element here that we simply drop that element into. And we then have on drag drop, well, we check the data transfer where we get that ID, and then we simply append it to that divider. And we also need to have allow drop, because when you drag something over an element, it kind of treats it like a link or something. But if we have this allow drop where we prevent the default, which is to treat it as a link, then we can allow dropping that element into the container. So how does this look in the browser? Well, I can simply start dragging this bad boy around, and I can place it inside of this container here. So that is what this svelte-dnd library uses under the hood. So how does this work? Well, we simply add a droppable container where we want elements to be droppable into, and then when we make some dividers which are draggable, and then we can simply move them around with a simple little event handler here. So whenever we drop an element, we also specify which kind of ID it has. So then we specify an item here that we can use to identify it here, and then modify our items array so that it's placed in the right place. So if I were to switch item 3 and item 1, well, we want them to update the order inside of this array. Well, this function will simply do that. So that was a nice straightforward way to have drag and drop in our application. But we have one major issue. It does not work on mobile. So we don't actually have access to this drag and drop API when we are on a mobile browser. It's simply not implemented by most major browsers that we have on our phones. And what did I do? Well, I tried to find another solution. I tried to find another library that we could use. And I actually found this drag drop touch library. So this can actually be used as a polyfill that enables drag and drop. It uses some weird pointer events under the hood to allow dragging and dropping even on touch devices, such as our mobile devices. And this did in fact allow me to drag and drop items, but the problem was that they were not ending up in the right place. The index that I was getting was completely wrong. It was placing things in completely incorrect positions. So after some consideration, I actually decided to go back to proven grounds, back to the library that I was always using when I wanted drag and drop, and that is svelte-dnd-action. It's a really nice mature library. It also has touch support. I've used it on mobile before and it has not really been a problem. The only real issue with this is that it's not written for Svelte 5. But as I said before, we have backwards compatibility, and I actually managed to add this to my project. And it's still well maintained, even though it's not been rewritten for Svelte 5. I also think that it generally has better design than the HTML5 draggable. It kind of looks like it just clones the item with the HTML5 draggable. It doesn't actually move it out of the way and things like that. With svelte-dnd actions, we can have access to all kinds of nice animations. Things are moving around as we try to place them there. It just feels a bit more nice. It just feels a bit more smooth. The experience is better with svelte-dnd action. So this is how that ended up. I can actually move these items around and they kind of move out of the way so that I can place them. It looks pretty nice, right? And how did this end up looking in code? Well, I added a new component called drag and drop container, where I simply specify the items that I want to be part of this drag and drop context. And then I utilized Svelte 5 snippets. So I can actually use Svelte 5 snippets to have this. This would not be possible in Svelte 4 before, because we couldn't actually have data for our slots. But now we can actually have components being rendered here. I can specify for this drag and drop container that I want this snippet item here to be rendering in a specific way. So I want to have a trackable card. And with svelte-dnd action, we simply use svelte action, as the name suggests, for this drag and drop zone. And here we specify the current items. And we also set the drop target style to be an empty object, because the default one is like a yellow border that doesn't look that good. And then we just loop over all of these items, and for all of these we render our component. So we have a nice little wrapper component that we can reuse for multiple places where we want to use drag and drop. And then to make svelte-dnd action happy, we need to have two event handlers. We need to have one on consider, and this is when we are considering putting an item in a specific place. When we are moving it around, we haven't dropped it yet, we haven't decided yet where we want it to go. Then we have the on consider, and then we have on finalize, and that is when we actually let go of our mouse button and we finalize the position of the item. So I handle this a bit differently. I actually use state for this, because I don't want to do the reordering every time we consider. This actually gets spammed quite a lot, so it's not that efficient if we were to re-render this whole component whenever that updates. But instead we have another state that we're kind of mirroring this property that we're getting in here. So when we are considering, then we just update the current item's state to be the e.detail.items that comes from svelte-dnd action. And when we have decided on what position we want, then we actually use on finalize, and that is where we're actually going to do the reordering in the backend, so to speak. But you might have noticed that we have quite a lot of other things going on around here. We have this drag disabled all over the place, and you might be wondering, what is this used for? Well, of course, it's just mobile being mobile and things being things. Svelte-dnd action works perfectly on the phone. If we have a full screen layout where the whole screen is filled with draggable items, how are we actually going to scroll on mobile? If all of these items are draggable, then we're simply going to start dragging things around and the user can't scroll anymore. So we actually need to have a way to delay that. We need to let the user scroll if they want to scroll, and only move items around if they actually intended to do that. And the way we solve that is by having a long press. So we actually only activate the dragging if the user is holding these items. But if we are on the desktop, we simply have no such thing. So on the desktop, there is no long pressing because we can just scroll with the mouse wheel, okay? But on mobile, we need to long press on these items. And that's why we need this drag disable. We need to disable the dragging if they are not pressing. So if they are long pressing, well, then we enable the dragging again. So in order to solve this, I looked on GitHub and I found that multiple people have had this problem in fact, and actually used this REPL here and modified it to my needs. So what this long press action does, it takes in a HTML element, and then we simply add a bunch of event listeners. We're adding the mouse down and the touch start and touch end. So if we are on mobile, then this is going to be a touch event. So then we simply record where we are and then we start a timeout. So if the user has not moved enough for 500 milliseconds with their pointer, then we simply dispatch an event to the parent component and say that yes, they have actually long pressed the item, and then we enable the dragging so that the item can be dragged again. And this is something that we need to reset again when we have our event handlers here. So we need to re-disable the dragging when they have finished considering or if they have finalized their decision. So now I can scroll completely fine here on mobile, and it's only when I long press these items that I can move them around. And how do I actually save this ordering? Well, we simply call this event handler that we're sending in on finalize. And finally, we end up here in on reorder, where we send it to the store and say that we should update and reorder these trackables. So the way I did this was actually to store the order on the trackables themselves. I considered having a separate data structure, a separate list or something of all the trackable IDs in the specific order that they wanted, but that is also a bit difficult because then we need to bookkeep, and if we add a new trackable, we need to update this order list. Suddenly it contains a trackable that was deleted or things like that. I decided that it's much easier to just have an order attribute on the trackables themselves. There is a con to this, which is that we simply need to update all of the trackables in the batch. If one order changes, well, then it's quite likely that all of the other orders will change as well. So we simply need to batch update all of these trackables. But I decided that that is not really a problem. If we have trackable categories, people are not going to have more than like 10 trackables in a category. So it should just be pretty efficient, and we're not going to be moving things around that often either. So I would say that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages in this case. It's much easier to just have a simple new attribute on our trackable, which is the order. And then in our store, where we have done all of the categorization, then we simply loop over all of the categories, and then we order these trackables in ascending order depending on their order attribute. Another thing that I modified as a side effect is actually to use the trackable ID as our key here. So we're actually storing a cached value of the trackable value, and the way I did this previously was to create that cache key inside of the component itself. So whenever this trackable card component was destroyed, when it was unmounted, we would simply get rid of that cached key. But this was a problem when we were doing reordering, because when we do reordering, we're using the store, and that updates all of the trackables. So then it would simply reload all of the trackables and refetch their values, and that's not that nice because we're simply destroying this component much more frequently. And the way I solved this was just to pass in the trackable ID and move it up the chain. So we actually do handle this here in the trackable list. So when we unmount the trackable list, simply when we go to a different page, if we're no longer viewing the trackable view, then we actually dispose of these keys. So like I write here, the trackables cards are re-rendered quite often, and that would actually lead them to dispose of their cached value and refetching them, which is not efficient. So we cache them for the whole duration of this trackable list component. And whenever this component is unmounted or destroyed is when we're actually disposing of these keys. This week I also implemented a nice hierarchy field, which I'm going to be using for mood tracking. So when I click this here, we can see we have 4 options in a grid. We have high energy unpleasant, high energy pleasant, and the same for unpleasant. So I can say that I have high energy pleasant. We can also then have a hierarchy where there are sub options. So I might say that I have low energy but pleasant, and that might be emotions like grateful or if I'm feeling content. So yeah, I can log this now. If I save this and go to the journal, we can see that we're actually sent in here directly to content. So the value of this mood trackable is low energy, pleasant, and then the sub emotion, so to speak, the more specialized emotion is content. And if we take a look at how this is stored in our journal entry, well, then we have a simple list primitive value that contains the values that we have specified. So we have a low pleasant and content. I also implemented a date and a date time form input fields, so we can have a nice date picker here where we select a specific date, but we can also have a date time picker where we specify both a date and an actual time. And of course I used a library for this. I used this nice library called svelte-picker where we can use to specify a nice svelte picker, and it's actually in fact already storing these dates as strings, which is how I want to store them, so I can just plug that in from the onChange event handler. One thing that I did need to modify was to change this position resolver because it was kind of not working in a modal. It was not rendering on top of the modal, it was actually hiding kind of underneath the modal. So I needed to set a higher set index, and this actually uses floating UI under the hood, this svelte-picker library. So I could actually specify this quite nicely and just specify that I want to have a fixed strategy. And then we specify that we want it to be placed 5 pixels underneath that input field that we have. So the app is coming along nicely. And I'm also very happy with the design work that I did this week for the mobile stuff. The UI definitely looks much nicer, definitely starts to look a bit more native-like. We probably aren't fooling too many people that it's a native app yet, but we are getting there slowly but surely. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you want to continue following along for next week as well. If you want to be part of the community that I'm trying to build, you can also join my Discord channel in the description below. I also posted a link to the GitHub of this project if you want to check out the source code as it evolves. Other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Peace out.